and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. And now, chapter 10, verse 1. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. For Moses writes about the righteousness that is based on the law, that the person who does the commandments shall live by them. But the righteousness based on faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the abyss, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. For the scripture says, everyone who believes in him will not be put to shame. Verse 12. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they're sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring the good news. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? In verse 17, so faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. But I ask, have they not heard? Indeed they have, for their voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. But I ask, did Israel not understand? First Moses says, I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. With a foolish nation I will make you angry. And then Isaiah is so bold as to say, I have been found by those who did not seek me. I have shown myself to those who did not ask for me. Now the last verse. But of Israel he says, all day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. Man, that is a lot of information. And it's very deep. And so what I want to do, as I said, I want to summarize what's been said, and then I want to ask some questions of the text, and hopefully after we answer those questions, we'll understand it better. I'm going to open with a little illustration. I remember when Amy and I were dating, I used to love playing tennis. I was never really good at it. I never could figure out how to serve the ball very well. I never had a very powerful serve. But I used to love playing tennis. Me and my friends would gather, at least once a week on usually Friday or Saturday night, and we'd play tennis for hours and hours and hours in Dothan. And then when Amy and I started dating, I came over to Laurel, and I brought my tennis racket one time, and I said, you know what? That'll be kind of fun. I'll teach Amy how to play a little tennis, and that'll be a little activity we can do. And so I was so proud of myself. I learned how to play. I could play some tennis with most people. And by the end of the day, Amy, this is the racket, this is the ball. Amy was very athletic as a teenager. So by the end of the day, Amy was running me corner to corner, and she was beating me. And that used to frustrate me so bad that I put all this effort into tennis and was so proud that I could hang with most of my friends only to come and get shown up by a girl. So that's how I kind of see, when I read a text that we're reading today, that's kind of how I see it. It's so funny that Israel had tried so hard to be the people of God, and they had been so diligent in their efforts, only to be shown up by the Gentiles, only to have those who weren't even trying come into the faith. That, to me, that I resonate with that. I understand that message. So let's go ahead and summarize the text. The text from chapter 9, verses 30 through 33 gives us the what. And here's the what of the passage. The deal is this: Israel rejected salvation through God's righteousness. They were looking for a righteousness, but it wasn't the kind of righteousness that was being offered. They were looking for their own righteousness. And verse 30 says this: the Gentiles who did not seek righteousness, they've obtained it. And then verse 31 says, the Jews who did seek for righteousness have not obtained it. So those who weren't even looking for it found it. Those who were looking for it with all their might couldn't get it. How frustrating, how topsy-turvy. Now verse 32 says, why didn't the Jews they asked the question, why didn't they obtain it? And it says, because they pursued an impossible goal, righteousness by works. And then verse 32 and 33 says they were scandalized by it. It became a stumbling block for them. It killed them that was the case. They couldn't get over that. They couldn't get their brain wrapped around, and it insulted them. It insulted their sense of who they were as a people. And then you go into chapter 10, verses 1 through 4. Why is this the case? And it says that Israel was ignorant of salvation by God's righteousness. They were ignorant of it. And then it says that from verses 1 and 2 that the Jews have a zeal for God, but their zeal is a misplaced, it's a mistaken zeal. In other words, they were sincere, but they were sincerely wrong. You see? They had a lot of zeal, but it was misplaced. And once we grasp verse 4 says that once we grasp the radical nature of Christ's work, it spells the end of legalism. When we understand truly what Christ has done for us, it makes our legalism disappear. And then now verses 5 through 8 of chapter 10, in summary, says that there are two ways of righteousness in the Bible. The Bible always offers us two ways of righteousness. The first way, and Paul gets into this by talking about Moses in Leviticus 18:5. He quotes Leviticus 18:5. And he tells us that we must obey the entire law to be saved. If we can obey the entire law perfectly, then we'll find salvation that way. And then verse 6 through 8, he quotes Moses again in Deuteronomy 30, verse 14. That kind of strange, it feels cryptic when you read it. It tells us that we can get, one way you can be obedient through perfect obedience of the law. And then he gives us another way, that we can get a new life through simple belief. Through simple belief. And verses 9 through 15 then tells us, how does that look? How do we become righteous God's way? Verse 9 says we have a first need, that we need to confess the work of Christ in history. And then in verse 9b, that we need to trust in that work in our heart. So we need to trust that it's true, and then we need to trust that from our heart that it's true. And verse 10, we have justification and salvation are essentially the same thing. And then verses 11 through 13 says that this is accessible to anyone and everyone. In other words, it's not just confined to one group of people. It's not just for the Jews, it's for the Gentiles, for the world. It's not confined just to a certain person. It's open to the nations, to all different kinds of people groups. And then verses 14 through 15 says this: there's a third need, to communicate the message of the good news through human beings. And then in verses 16 through 21, Paul returns to the question. He goes right back to the original question. So why did Israel reject God's way of righteousness? Why did they do it? Because it says not all Israel believed, as Isaiah told. They did not. And then he says this in verse 18: did they not hear the message? Did Israel's belief, was it because they didn't hear it? And of course Paul says, of course they heard it. That's all they heard. And then Paul asks the question, so if they heard it, did they not understand it? And then he answers that the Jews knew the need for righteousness, but the Gentiles did not. And the overall reason for Israel's unbelief was just sheer stubbornness. They just were hard-hearted. They were stiff-necked. That's been Israel's problem from the very beginning. They were stiff-necked. Now, that's the summary of this text. I've just summarized what the argument is, the flow of it. Now, let's ask some questions of it to get deeper. Anybody have any questions so far? Okay, now, first question is this. In verses 30 through 33 of chapter 9, what does Paul say is the reason for Jewish unbelief? And does this contradict what Paul says in the first part of chapter 9 that y'all looked at hopefully last week? Now, to remind you, in Romans chapter 9, verses 1 through 29, seems the first part of Romans and the first part of Romans 9 and the second part of Romans 9 seem to contradict each other. There seems to be two different truths that are at work. And if you're not careful, you'll get very confused when you read the first part of chapter 9 and then read the second part. Paul, in the first part of chapter 9, attributes unbelief to the Jews, to God's sovereign purpose. From Romans chapter 9:30 through chapter 10 that we read today, it ascribes their unbelief to their own blindness. So on the one hand, it's God's sovereign purpose at work, and the other hand, it's their own problem. It's their own unbelief. It's their lack of belief. Which is it? You know, is it God's sovereign election? Is it his sovereign purposes? Or is it man's choice? Is it his own will? Which is it? Because it looks to me like, if you look at this, it looks like these two are at least two opposing views, you know? And isn't that the big question anyway? Isn't that what makes Presbyterians look weird? Because or cold-hearted sometimes, because we tend to focus on one and not the other. So why does this not contradict the earlier part of chapter 9? How do we make this work? Paul is showing us that God's sovereignty and human responsibility stand in relationship to each other as what's known as an antinomy. Have you ever heard of that word, antinomy? It's an apparent contradiction. You have two truths that look like they're opposed to each other, but in reality they stand together. And it's our folly that we can't understand it. A famous example of an antinomy is the fact that light sometimes behaves as particles, and at other times it appears as waves. That's an apparent contradiction. And we don't understand that yet, but one day when we get enough knowledge, we'll understand that apparent contradiction. But we can expect that in the future. The Bible never says this. The Bible never says that this event happened totally in accord with God's plan, and therefore human beings are not responsible for their actions. Nor does the Bible say that human beings were responsible for their actions, therefore the event was not certain to happen according to God's plan. But rather, the Bible holds both of these truths together. The complete sovereignty of God over all history and the complete responsibility of every human being for their behavior. Those two things stand together. I want to read a quote from Martin Lloyd-Jones that I think captures this idea of antinomy. And it helps us see how God can save people through election, and yet people who disbelieve are still responsible for their behavior. And this is what it says. He says this, in Romans 9, this is Martin Lloyd-Jones talking, in Romans 9, verses 6 through 29, Paul explains why anybody is saved. It is the sovereign election of God, period. In these verses 30 through 33, he's showing as to why anybody's lost. And the explanation of that is their own responsibility. So this is what the Bible teaches. Election alone accounts for the saved, but non-election does not account for the lost. No one would be saved were it not that God in a sovereign manner has chosen him, as we have seen abundantly from verses 6 to 29. It is God's action alone that saves anyone. So why is anyone lost? Is it because they're not elected? No. What accounts for the lost is their rejection of the gospel. We are not responsible for our acceptance of the gospel, but we are responsible for our rejection of it. We are not responsible for our acceptance of the gospel, but we are responsible for our rejection of it. Now, that is mind-blowing. My favorite quote about this whole idea of antinomy in salvation is from Charles Spurgeon. Listen to what Charles Spurgeon says. This is, I think, one of the most profound things that a man has ever said regarding this. He says this: "If then I find taught in one part of the Bible that everything is foreordained, that is true. And if I find in another scripture that man is responsible for all his actions, that is true. And it is only my folly that leads me to imagine that these two truths can ever contradict each other. I do not believe that they can ever be welded into one upon any. I do not believe that they can ever be welded into one upon any earthly anvil, but they certainly shall be one in eternity. They are two lines that are so nearly parallel that the human mind which pursues them furthest will never discover that they converge. But they do converge, and they will meet somewhere in eternity close to the throne of God, whence all truth doth spring." I think that puts it pretty well. So that's the first question. We're saved because of God's sovereign election, and we are lost because of our own disobedience, our own lack of obeying and following God. Now, the second question I want to ask of the text is this, and we find this in verses 30 through 33. What is completely topsy-turvy about the situation that Paul describes and how Jews and Gentiles respond to the gospel? Why do you think that people were concerned about, why do you think that people more concerned about religion and righteousness might be more prone to miss the gospel? Why is it that those who weren't even looking for it in the first place found it, and those who worked as hard as they could possibly work missed it? Why is it so hard for religious people and moral people to miss out on the gospel? And why is it so much easier for those who have lived a pagan lifestyle, perhaps, to find it so much easier? So the situation that Paul has been describing all along is a growing majority of the church was Gentile. The big debate in the book of Romans is, who was Paul talking to? Was he talking to Gentiles or Jews? That's been a raging debate forever. But in general, he says that the Gentiles are more responsive to the gospel than the Jews. And so this topsy-turviness of the situation is depicted by Paul in this striking statement in verse 30. The Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness, they've attained it. And this is something of an understatement, isn't it? I mean, the pagans described in Romans 1, you know, how wicked, go back and look at Romans 1 and see how wicked that those of the world are. And we like to refer to that. But they did not have a full picture of righteousness, as did the Jews who had the full law of God. And so the Gentiles had a basic outline in their consciences of what's right and wrong. They kind of had a basic understanding of what's right and wrong just by virtue of them having a conscience. But they did not follow those consciences. Rather, they pursued selfishness and pleasure. This is also true of modern people as well, modern pagans in our own culture. But ironically, the Gentiles who lived such wicked lives were more open to the gospel, the righteousness that is by faith alone. Now, on the other hand, Israel, who pursued a law of righteousness, has not obtained it. The Jews had a deep awareness of that they needed to be right before God. They knew that. They knew that they served a holy God. They saw how God acted. They saw what God was like in the wilderness. They saw that you didn't trample on him, and they knew that you had to be careful and that he was holy. And therefore, you better cross your T's and dot your I's if you're going to be in his presence. They knew that. And so they had a deep awareness that they needed to be righteous before God. But the Gentiles had no such developed understanding of a righteousness to appear before God. And yet the Jews, they pursued a righteousness by works. And since they sought to create their own righteousness as a way of standing before God, they stumbled over this concept of righteousness as a gift. They couldn't understand that. But I mean, think about it. All this effort, all these laws that were outlined, all these procedures, all these things that they had to do, it so confused them that when it was presented as a gift, they couldn't get it. It didn't make any sense to them. They didn't resonate with it. They stumbled over this concept. And so the topsy-turvy irony can be put in several ways. This is what Tim Keller says. The ones who knew the most about God did not come to know God, while the ones who knew the least about God came to know God the best. Or to put it another way, the ones who most wanted to be righteous end up dead in their sins, while the ones who least wanted to be righteous end up holy and blameless in His sight. And so it's not that difficult to understand what happened to the Jews and Gentiles if we think about the different ways that religious and moral people and irreligious pagans respond to the gospel even today. I mean, the modern pagans today trample the gospel under their feet, especially when they're young. But as time goes on, they come to recognize their own sin, and maybe they come to even sense their own spiritual, emptiness, and with a deep sense of regret and brokenness. And then they come to faith, because as they get older, they start to sense that something's not right, that I'm empty. I've been pursuing my own pleasure, and that's not got me anywhere. And you can, if you want to look at this, if you want to take a step back and you want to get a good picture of what was being said here, just look at the prodigal son parable. Jesus is explaining this right here through the prodigal son. And so religious people are much less honest with themselves about their sin and generally have a smugness and a condescending attitude toward others. And a feeling like, okay, I try hard and I do everything right, and therefore we don't say this out loud, but we imply it in our thinking. If I work so hard and I do this, and this, and this, that at some level God's going to owe me and let me in. Religious people are either offended by the gospel. In other words, you mean to tell me that somebody can be on death row and just say with their mouth and believe in their heart that God has risen Jesus from the dead, and if they put their trust there that they're saved, just like me, and I've never touched a hair on anybody's head, I've never harmed a soul. Are you trying to tell me that I've been going to church all my life, and I've been memorizing the scriptures, and I've been doing this, and this, but somebody on death row can be saved? It doesn't make sense sometimes. And then, or they run the gospel through their own works righteousness grid and reinterpret it to fit it in their grid. So they fool themselves into thinking they've already heard the gospel. Richard Lovelace says this. He says, "This may seem to be the most elemental concept in the Protestant tradition, but is just as rare an act of faith among Protestants as among Catholics. We all automatically gravitate toward the assumption that we are justified by our level of sanctification." He continues, he says, "We start each day with our own personal security resting not on the accepting love of God, but the sacrifice of Christ, but on our own present feelings or recent achievements in religion. And since these arguments will not quiet the human conscience, we are inevitably moved to a self-righteousness which falsifies the record to achieve a sense of peace." So the third question I want to ask to drive us through this text is on verses 1 through 8 of chapter 10. What does Paul give Israel credit for? And then what does he say is the reason they did not submit to the gospel? And then why blame them? And then how does Paul show that they should have known the gospel in the first place? So Paul what does he give Israel credit for? I'm going to ask you this question. Does anybody know what he says? You're good at this. What does he say? Do you see that there? What does Paul say? Israel, you're good at this. They're zealous. They have fervor. They are gung-ho God in all their efforts. And of course, Paul knew this firsthand, didn't he? Paul was a Jew among Jews. He himself, as a Jew, was extremely zealous to please and honor and serve God, or so he thought. And so they were willing to go to any lengths to obey God, any lengths. And then, so Paul's giving them, give credit where credit's due, he's saying, and granting how good it is for Israel to respect the honor of God. That's a good thing that they did that. But Paul says that the reason for Israel going astray is that zeal is not enough. You can be zealous about something, but if it's misplaced zeal, then you're dead in the water. And so zeal must be based on knowledge. And this is a complete contradiction of a common proverb of our time, where today it doesn't matter what you believe as long as you believe in something, and as long as you're sincere about it and zealous about it. As a matter of fact, I was reading, I'm going to probably distribute a paper here soon that I got from Baton Rouge. Victor and I were in Baton Rouge, and Garrett Dawson taught on the current climate of our culture and critical race theory, and some of the elements of that make it such a damaging philosophy. And one of the tenets of critical race theory is that the fact that you use facts to back up your argument is oppressive. That the mere fact that you claim a set of facts is considered oppression and aggressive and is to be condemned. Now that is scary. If you can't rely on facts, then you've got a problem. Victor? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I'll try to send that link out if you'd like to see it. It's fascinating. But anyway, Paul says that the Jews were sincere and zealous in their beliefs, but their beliefs were erroneous, that they're mistaken. Their zeal. And if we think about it, zeal without what does zeal without knowledge turn into? If somebody is zealous about something and they have no knowledge of it, what is that called? Fanaticism. Yeah, terrorism. Imagine a lady who loves her neighbor so much that she appreciates her neighbor so much that she brings a bouquet of flowers to her because she loves her, but her neighbor is desperately allergic to them. The zeal without knowledge can be fatal. I mean, the lady who's given the flowers might sincerely, have affection for her neighbor and want to show and express to her neighbor how much she loves him, but without the knowledge that her neighbor is allergic to those flowers and may kill her, it becomes an act of terrorism, doesn't it? So imagine a person who intensely believes that a poison solution is not fatal, but if she drinks it, she'll be dead. Her zeal not only did not help her, but her zeal actually helped her die. That's what Paul is saying here. Why blame them then if their problem is ignorance? If it's ignorance, then why blame them? And we see here that Paul says, since they did not know the righteousness from God, they did not submit to it. And we see that the ignorance is what Keller calls vincible ignorance. Vincible ignorance. There is a sincere zeal at its base, but they stay ignorant, not because the information is unavailable, but because it doesn't suit them. Because they're too vested into their own program, their own religion, that any change does not suit them, and it causes them to have to wipe away the whole thing. And they were too far in their mind, they were too far in to do anything different. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind is made up. That's the overall attitude of Israel. Fanatics are people who have zeal and sincerity, but it is a zeal that refuses reflection, and they refuse to stop and think things through. So they're sincere, but they can do a lot of damage. When they do, we hold them responsible because they should have known better. One of the ways that Paul shows that their ignorance was invincible is in reference to the Old Testament. I think, when I was studying this, I never quite understood this part of Romans until Keller explained it in his book here. But Paul quotes Moses twice to show that though Moses could be read as teaching moralism, and he did know that law-keeping was not enough. First, Paul quotes Leviticus 18:5, where Moses says about the law that the man who does these things will also live because of them. Now, on the surface of it, it seems to mean that Moses is teaching that there's a possible way of getting salvation through law-keeping. And actually, all Moses was saying is that if you could obey the law perfectly, you would receive eternal life. If you could do it perfectly, you'd receive eternal life. Of course, that's true. But that is not the whole picture. We know it's impossible to do that. If you could, you'd be saved, but you can't. It's impossibility. I've sinned. I have broken the law since I've been up here teaching you. There's been something going on in my brain at some point that was a sin. And you have too. So if you could keep the law, you could attain salvation, but you can't. The second thing is, Paul says, he quotes Deuteronomy 30. And to understand Paul's argument, we need to understand the whole part of Deuteronomy 30, 1 through 14. And though he only quotes verse 14, he makes allusions to the whole passage. And this, hang with me here, because if you understand this, it really clears it. I think it opens up something that most of us don't normally see. In Deuteronomy 30, 1 through 2, Moses talks about the fact that Israel will stray away from God and receive curses and punishment. And then in chapter 30, verse 6 of Deuteronomy, he says, "The Lord your God," listen, "will circumcise your hearts, that you may love him with all your heart and soul, and therefore live." In other words, salvation. And then, after he says that, in verse 11 of chapter 30, Deuteronomy, he says, "Now what I am telling you is not impossible to do. You don't have to go to heaven or over the sea to do it." And Paul alludes to this in Romans 10, verse 6 through 7, without quoting Moses directly. Then he quotes Moses, saying, "My word is very near to you in your mouth and heart." What's Paul saying here? Paul is saying, by pointing to Deuteronomy 30, he shows that Moses knew something more than law-keeping was required. They needed a new heart. That's why Moses talks about the circumcision of the heart. Moses says, in effect, this is what Moses is saying in Deuteronomy 30. To receive this word does not take incredible feats. It is something you do in your mouth and your heart. And then Paul picks up on this and says, see, Moses knew that it was faith from the heart that would bring you home. In other words, you don't have to scale heaven. And that's when he says, for Christ already came down from it. And then Moses says, or you don't have to die, for Christ has already done that. You just need to believe. Moses knew that you just had to believe. It wasn't a works righteousness, it was belief. A circumcised heart. Isn't that wonderful to see? That justification by faith has been always, it was even preached by Moses in Deuteronomy 30. And we so misunderstand all of Moses' teaching by claiming he was a moralist. Now, the fourth question I want to ask is this. When we say that Christ is the end of the law, what does that mean? Because I'm telling you, there's a lot of confusion about what that means. And there's a lot of confusion in Laurel about what that means to say that Christ is the end of the law. Paul does not say here that the very category of the law has ended. He's not saying that. Nor that the binding nature of the law is ended. He's not saying that either. The law is still relevant. It's still a category, and it's still relevant. Paul's saying that Christ's work shows that the law as a way of righteousness is ended so that faith may be seen as the way of righteousness. When Christ is the end of the law, he's the goal of the law. He's what the law points to. From Romans 6, 1 through from Romans 6 through 8, we know that what is ended for the Christian is being under the law as a system of salvation. Now, what is not ended is, this is what has not ended, okay? In terms of a system of salvation, the Christian is not under the law as a system of salvation, okay? That's not binding. What is binding is this. It's our obligation to obey the law as a way to please and express our gratitude to the one who has saved us by grace. That's still binding. And yet and yet many people are out saying that Christ being the end of the law does not bind us to obedience. And that is a fallacy, and it is dangerous to say such a thing. Now, the fifth question. What do these verses tell us about how to become a Christian? First, it says this. There's a truth that has to be known. You can't just believe in belief. There has to be something that you place your belief in. There's a body of, there's some data out there that you have to, that has to be placed before you, that you have to look at and understand first. So the body of the content is seen as in consisting of this. There has to be something you have to believe in to be saved. There's some facts here. And the first, and what it is Jesus and his person, and Jesus and his work. You have to believe in his person and his work. And you'll see in our worship service today, we celebrate those two ideas in our hymns, the way that we picked our hymns. The first hymn refers to Jesus' work, his person, the fact that he's Lord of all hail the power of Jesus' name. And then the second hymn we're going to sing is concerning his work, the power of the cross. Those two set of facts are something that we must believe in order to be saved. Now, and of course, there's a great hymn by Indelible Grace. It says, "Upon a life I did not live, upon a death I did not die. Another's life, another's death, on this I stake my whole eternity." So first, there's a truth that must be known. You can't just believe in order to be saved. There has to be something you believe in. Now, secondly, there's the truth that must be believed from the heart. So you have to believe it, and then you have to believe it from the heart. In the context of the rest of Romans 10, we can see what believe means. When he says the word heart, it's a token for the whole body, for your whole self. When he says believe in your heart, that means your whole self needs to be a part of this. It means that we are to trust our whole self to the person and the work of Christ as our righteousness. We are to transfer all of our trust from our own efforts to be righteous to Christ's righteousness on our behalf. That is the faith that saves, not merely a general belief that Christ lived, that he was some dude that appeared on this earth, 2,000 years ago, walked around, did some cool teaching, and then they pinned him on a cross. That's not the nature of what we believe in here. To confess with the mouth is simply a part of believing with the heart. We confess with our mouth, we believe with our heart. That's saying the same thing. That's parallelism there. That's saying the same thing. That's not two separate things. In other words, we don't just confess with the mouth and then later believe in our hearts. Those are two things that describe belief. They both mean to profess Christ. So anyone who does believe expresses this belief. Now the third thing, we have truth, we have belief. The third thing is we learn from verses 11 through 13 is that becoming a Christian is equally possible and available to, in verse 11 says anyone, and verse 12 says to everyone. Anyone and everyone. Because there is no difference between Jew and Gentile with regard to need. Now, this is what he's saying. He's not saying that salvation is going to come to everybody. He's saying that salvation is available to all kinds of people, Jews and Greeks, or Jews and non-Jews. It's not just God's chosen people, the nation of Israel, that are located in a certain spot on this planet. That the salvation is available to all different kinds of people groups, not just Israel. So now the last question is this, the sixth question, when it's based on verses 14 through 17. What do these verses tell us then about evangelism? What do these verses tell us about evangelism? Evangelism is very important, and it's so often neglected, especially in our circles. There's 4 verbs that Paul uses here to describe what evangelism is. First of all, the verb sent in verse 15. The verb sent, it just means that somebody is sent. It refers to how Christ, through his church, sent out missionaries, preachers, and lay people to be messengers. It's the word apostolos there in the Greek. There is somebody who is sent out. That's the first part of evangelism. And then in verse 14, you see the verb preach. And that's the word that means to herald. It's not just something that you get up and it doesn't describe a sermon. It describes somebody on a street corner. It's the picture of somebody heralding the newspaper, whatever, latest news, and get out and scream into the top of their lungs, I've got some news for you. You've got to hear this. That's what the word preach means. It's a heralding of some truth, that with the feeling that everybody needs to hear this message. There's an urgency about it. And so the third verb here that we see that describes evangelism, so you have send, you have preach, then the third one you have heard, the verb heard, and that's in verse 14. Paul probably has in mind here more than just exposure. In other words, faith just can't mystically happen in somebody. In other words, you can't just, you can just go to sleep, and put your Bible on top of your head and wake up and think, oh, now I'm a Christian. It's not just, you can't just go and hear something and go to sleep and the sound getting in your ears magically makes you a Christian. The message of the Bible needs to be really heard and then understood. There has to be an intellectual assent to it. It has to logically make sense to you, and then it has to existentially grip you, emotionally grip you, to where you have an experience of it. There's a knowledge that it makes sense to you, and then there's an emotional reaction to it that grips you and it draws you into it. And then this word believe in verse 13. This is what makes Christians. So what Paul is teaching about evangelism is this. First of all, it's absolutely necessary. How can they believe without someone preaching to them? And the second thing is that it requires a willingness to speak out. Somebody's got to go and preach it. And it requires not only just a willingness to preach, but a persuasion to get somebody to understand it. And it requires the transmission of a body of truth that's not just an opinion, but it's an authoritative revelation of Christ's work on the cross by those who are sent out. Now, that's the nature of evangelism. The last question Paul gets to is this. How do we summarize the steps in Paul's final case for why Israel is inexcusable? Paul, after he explains the way of salvation, the 2 ways of righteousness, and he explains why the Gentiles believed and why Israel did not, Paul goes back to his original argument and says, let's talk then about why Israel is inexcusable in their unbelief. First question is, Paul, what I like about Paul and the way he teaches is that he asks questions. It's kind of a, what do you call that? There's a method that they teach in law school about, that's a method. Paul asks questions, then he answers them. Didn't they hear the gospel? Verse 18, he says, didn't Israel hear the gospel? And of course the answer is, of course they did. Well, if anybody ever heard the gospel, it was Israel. They had every opportunity with all the symbolism, all the worship liturgies and the Psalter, all the prophets and all the rest. They had every opportunity to hear the gospel, and they missed it. Wherever a Jewish community existed, the gospel had been preached. That was Paul's point. So the second question is, well, if they heard the gospel, didn't they understand it? And of course the answer is, this is what Paul is showing. His answer is scary. Paul is saying that it is possible to be exposed to the gospel and not really understand it. It is possible to be exposed to the gospel all your life and not understand it. But he answers, here's the thing that really is haunting. They did understand it. Paul says they did understand it. He quotes Deuteronomy 32:21 to show that it is only the Gentiles that did not understand the gospel. They did not know the nature of God and His holiness, or the need for righteousness, or the promises of forgiveness by substitution, and all that the tabernacle got to. Especially that the Lord could become our righteousness. Gentiles did not know that, but Israel did. Israel did know that. They did understand it. And Deuteronomy 32:21 shows that God, in a sense, shows them up with the Gentiles, making them envious of them. So the third question is, if they had heard and they did understand, then why didn't they believe? If they had all the knowledge and they understood that knowledge, why didn't they believe? And the answer is, Paul first says that the Gentiles had found God, though they did not seek Him. And secondly, he quotes Isaiah about how God had held out His hands to Israel. You know, God, the picture is God, I've held my hands out to you among all people that you would believe. But you didn't, because you were hard-hearted. You understood it, you knew it, you saw it, you understood it, but you still didn't believe because you're hard-hearted. You're stubborn. He didn't hold out His hands to the Gentiles like He did to the Jews. He did not give the Gentiles anything approaching what He gave to the Jews, and yet they responded better than the Jews did. And that's why Israel is not to be excused for their refusal. God is sovereign, but this does not mean that there is any excuse for disobeying His call to believe the gospel. That's on us. If we reject the gospel, it's on us. If we believe the gospel, it's on Him. So we are without excuse. And this passage leaves us with two stark truths. This is how I'm going to close. This is how the passage leaves us with these two stark truths. Every human is responsible for how they treat the word of Christ. Every human is responsible for how they treat the word of Christ. And then every Christian is responsible for communicating that word of Christ. We're all responsible for communicating it. Everyone will answer to God for whether they supplied that last link in the chain, belief. But we must ensure that wherever it is that God has placed us, that no one around us can say that they have not heard or understood the gospel. As a result of us being there, it is our responsibility to make sure that that message is out and that people are hearing that message. The message of the gospel has to go with the people of the gospel. We cannot go out and not proclaim that gospel. All right? Anybody have any questions before we close? Thanks for your patience and bearing. That's a lot of stuff we went through here, and I appreciate your patience in that. Let's pray, and then we'll prepare for worship here in about 15 minutes. Father, thank you for our time today, and I pray, Lord, that as people who have been exposed to your word, some of us all of our lives, Lord, that we would guard against being stubborn or hard-hearted, that we would keep in check, Lord, our sense of entitlement, that we would throw away that grid that says we have to work for your pleasure, for your salvation. Lord, help us to trust in deeper ways the person and work of Jesus Christ, that He is Lord and that He has saved us by His work on the cross, and what we do is transfer